It all started on a calm Saturday morning when I was fixing up my little cabin by the lake. The sun was rising over the water, the air was crisp, and I was ready for a quiet day. That peace was short-lived because Karen from the HOA showed up with her usual clipboard and sour expression. She marched right onto my property like she owned it and announced that I had 30 days to officially join her HOA. I told her politely that my land was never part of her association and I had no interest in paying her fees or following her endless rules. Her face turned red, and she leaned in closer, lowering her voice, as if she was delivering some kind of threat. She said if I refused to join, she would make my life miserable with fines, complaints, and constant inspections. I could not help but laugh at her words because none of what she said applied to me or my land. Karen did not like that laugh one bit and stormed away, muttering that she would have me under her control soon enough. For the next week, she tried everything to pressure me. She sent letters demanding dues. She left notes taped to my door warning of penalties. She even called the county office trying to report me for building violations that did not exist. Every day, it seemed, she came up with a new way to poke at me, but what Karen did not know was that I had already been working on something big behind the scenes. I had been in contact with the owner of a small condo unit in the very same complex where Karen lived. The owner wanted to sell, and I saw an opportunity too perfect to pass up. After a few meetings and some paperwork, the deal was done. I officially owned the condo, right underneath Karen's nose. The day I walked into the HOA meeting and casually mentioned that I was her new landlord, her jaw nearly hit the table. Karen turned pale, and the room went completely silent. For the first time since I met her, she had nothing to say. The woman who always had threats, complaints, and accusations ready was suddenly frozen in her chair, unable to speak. All she could do was stare as the rest of the members looked at her in shock and amusement. From that moment on, everything about her tone shifted. Instead of barking orders at me, she kept her distance. Instead of threatening me with HOA rules, she avoided eye contact altogether. It was as if buying that condo had flipped the balance of power overnight. And while she still strutted around the neighborhood with her clipboard, I noticed she walked a little slower whenever I passed by. Because now Karen knew that her threats no longer worked. Now she had to live with the fact that the very man she tried to control was the one who owned the roof over her head. Karen tried to brush it off at first, pretending like my new ownership did not bother her. She forced a smile in front of the other members and acted as if everything was fine. But the tension in her voice betrayed her, and everyone could see it. Behind that fake grin, she was boiling. I started getting reports from neighbors that Karen was more irritable than ever, snapping at people over the smallest things. One neighbor said she nearly lost her mind because someone left a garden hose uncoiled on their lawn. Another told me she had started inspecting paint colors on mailboxes, as if she were some government official. But around me, she was careful. She avoided confrontation, and her tone was suddenly polite. It was almost funny to watch her struggle to swallow her pride whenever I walked into the room. I decided not to push her too far, but I also was not going to let her forget what had happened. One afternoon, I stopped by the condo office to check on a few things and ran into Karen in the hallway. She froze when she saw me. For a moment, I thought she might turn around and run, but instead she stood there clutching her clipboard so tight her knuckles turned white. I greeted her casually and asked if everything was going well with her unit. Her face twitched as she muttered a quick yes before hurrying away without another word. The neighbors started noticing the change too. They whispered among themselves about how Karen no longer held the same power. Some even thanked me quietly for standing up to her. It was clear they had suffered under her petty rules and constant harassment for years. Now, they were finally seeing someone put her in her place. What Karen had not realized was that her threats had given me the perfect motivation to take action. And now the tables had turned in a way she could never undo. Because every time she walked into her condo, she was reminded that she no longer had the upper hand. And the silence that followed whenever she crossed paths with me was louder than any threat she had ever made. Karen tried to act as though she was still in control during meetings, but her voice did not carry the same authority it once did. The other members were no longer afraid to question her decisions, and some even ignored her completely. She would bring up rules about lawn decorations or garbage cans, but no one paid attention anymore. It was like her power had slipped right through her fingers. One evening I was walking past the pool area when I saw a group of neighbors sitting together chatting and laughing. Karen stood off to the side, clearly irritated that she was not included in their conversation. When she finally approached the group and tried to scold them for leaving chairs out of place, one of the neighbors calmly told her that it was no longer her business. The look on her face was priceless. For the first time, she realized she could not intimidate people the way she used to. I kept my distance and let things play out. The more Karen tried to cling to control, the more people pulled away from her. She was unraveling slowly, and everyone could see it. A few days later, I got a message from another neighbor who said Karen had been knocking on doors asking for signatures to support her leadership. But no one was willing to sign anything. She was desperate, and it showed. Later that week, I found her sitting on a bench outside the condo office, staring off into the distance. She looked tired, worn down, as if the weight of her own behavior had finally caught up with her. When she noticed me walking by, she straightened her posture, but her eyes told a different story. It was the first time I saw doubt instead of arrogance in her expression. Karen, who once ruled the community with fear, was now struggling just to keep her image intact. And the more she tried to fight it, the more her own walls crumbled around her. Karen eventually stood from the bench and walked toward me, though her steps were slower than usual. She asked in a low voice if I was enjoying myself watching everything fall apart. I stayed calm and told her that I had never wanted conflict, only fairness. Her face twitched as though she wanted to argue, but instead she sighed deeply. For a moment, it looked like she was searching for the right words, but nothing came out. Neighbors passing by gave polite nods to me and barely acknowledged Karen. It was clear the tide had shifted, and she could feel it. Later that evening, I attended a community meeting where residents gathered to discuss new improvements for the neighborhood. Karen showed up trying to sit at the head of the table, like she always did. But the property manager asked her to take a regular seat among the others. The room went silent as everyone waited for her reaction. Her cheeks flushed red, and she reluctantly sat down without saying a word. That small moment spoke louder than any confrontation could. The authority she once boasted about had slipped away completely. After the meeting, people lingered to talk with me, asking questions and offering ideas for future projects. Karen left quietly, without her usual complaints or attempts to dominate the room. It was strange seeing her so subdued. Over the next few days, I noticed she avoided eye contact whenever we crossed paths. It was as though she finally understood that her reign of intimidation was over. But deep inside, I could sense she was plotting something new, trying to find another way to regain control. One afternoon, I was walking back from the coffee shop when I saw Karen talking to a man in a suit near the parking lot. She was gesturing wildly, pointing in my direction and whispering as if she did not want others to hear. The man nodded politely, but I noticed his eyes kept drifting toward me as though he was already skeptical of her words. I approached calmly and greeted them with a simple smile. Karen stiffened and quickly introduced the man as a so-called consultant she had hired to help restore order to the community. I asked what kind of order she was referring to, since the neighborhood had been running just fine without her interference. Her lips tightened, and she muttered that people had forgotten respect and rules. The consultant cleared his throat and admitted he had reviewed the property records and found no HOA authority in place over my home or several others. The look on Karen's face was priceless as her last hope slipped away. Still, she tried to salvage the moment by claiming that community spirit required structure and leadership. I calmly told her that leadership was earned through trust and not forced with threats. A couple of neighbors had gathered nearby, and one of them even clapped at my words, which made Karen flush with anger. She quickly excused herself and stormed off, leaving the consultant shaking his head at her behavior. As the crowd dispersed, I could feel the quiet satisfaction in the air, as if everyone had finally seen Karen stripped of the power she once clung to. But deep down, I knew Karen was not the kind to give up so easily, and her silence meant she was already planning her next move. The next few days were strangely quiet, and for a moment I wondered if Karen had finally accepted defeat. But then early one morning I noticed a stack of freshly printed flyers taped to mailboxes around the neighborhood. Each flyer carried bold letters urging residents to sign a petition for the creation of a brand new HOA, with Karen as the founding president. I pulled one of the papers down and shook my head, knowing exactly what game she was trying to play. Later that evening, as I walked down the street, I saw Karen standing on a corner trying to hand out her flyers with a forced smile. Most neighbors accepted them politely, only to crumple them up the moment they turned away. One man even told her directly that he had no intention of paying dues to line her pockets and walked off without another word. Her smile faltered, but she kept pushing her narrative, insisting the community would fall apart without her leadership. I could see the desperation in her eyes, and I knew she was trying to regain the control she had already lost. Instead of confronting her, I decided to wait and let her wear herself out. A few days later, a community meeting was announced at the recreation hall, and curiosity drew nearly everyone in town. When I arrived, I found Karen standing at the front with a stack of papers and a projector ready to deliver her grand presentation. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as people waited to see what she would try this time. Karen started strong, talking about property values, order, and unity, but as she continued, her voice wavered, and she grew visibly nervous. I sat calmly in the crowd, knowing the truth would soon come out as the neighbors began asking pointed questions she was not prepared to answer. One neighbor stood up and asked her how much the monthly dues would be and where the money would actually go. Karen hesitated, flipping through her notes, as if the answer might magically appear on the page. Another neighbor pressed her on why she felt entitled to enforce rules on land she did not own. Karen stammered and tried to shift the blame, saying that without her leadership, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. The crowd began to murmur with frustration, and I could see the tide turning against her. Finally, I raised my hand and stood up, holding the room in silence. I calmly explained that there were already property laws in place and that no one needed to pay extra fees to someone who had no legal authority. I reminded everyone how Karen had tried to fine me over my own truck and even threatened me when I refused to join her non-existent HOA. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, and more voices rose supporting me. The room grew louder, with people calling out their own stories of Karen knocking on their doors, making demands, and leaving notes with empty threats. Karen's face turned pale as the stories piled up one after another. She tried to interrupt, insisting that everyone was misunderstanding her intentions, but the crowd had stopped listening. For the first time, she was outnumbered, out-argued, and completely stripped of the false power she had been clinging to. The council chair finally cleared his throat and said it was obvious the neighborhood had no desire to form any association under Karen's direction. A round of applause broke out from the neighbors, and Karen froze in place, her hands gripping the edge of the podium. She tried to regain her composure and said she only wanted to bring order and respect to the community, but her voice trembled. Someone in the back shouted that respect is earned, not forced, and the room erupted in agreement. Karen's shoulders slumped as she realized she had lost control of the meeting. I watched her scan the faces in the room, looking for even one ally, but no one came to her defense. The weight of the silence pressed down on her until she muttered something about people being ungrateful and began gathering her papers. Neighbors started whispering to each other, but their whispers were filled with relief and satisfaction. For once, the entire community stood united against the unnecessary rules and false authority Karen had been trying to impose. As she walked toward the exit, her steps were heavy and slow, like someone carrying the weight of defeat. But deep down, I had a feeling she was not done yet. Karen paused at the door, her back still turned to the room. For a moment, it looked like she might leave quietly, but then she spun around, her eyes sharp and her lips pressed tight. "This is not over," she said in a low, steady voice. The words sent a ripple through the room, but no one answered her. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, and the sound echoed through the hall. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, some relieved she was gone, others worried about what she might try next. I stayed calm, but inside I knew Karen was not the type to give up control without a fight. Later that evening, I noticed her car parked outside her condo, the blinds in her window drawn shut, though I could see her silhouette pacing back and forth. It was clear her mind was already turning, plotting her next move. The neighborhood might have won this battle, but something told me Karen had no intention of letting it end here. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, and I saw Karen already standing on the sidewalk, her arms crossed and her phone clutched in her hand. She did not look at me, but I could feel the weight of her glare as she spoke into the phone in a hushed but heated tone. I caught pieces of her words, something about legal rights, something about violations and property rules. She was calling someone important, or at least she wanted me to think she was. I decided to keep calm and walked to my truck, pretending not to notice her. But Karen was not one to stay quiet for long. "You think you can embarrass me in front of everyone?" she suddenly snapped, her voice cutting through the morning air. The neighbor's curtains twitched, some already watching. I leaned against my truck and looked at her calmly. "Karen, you brought this on yourself." Her face reddened, her grip tightening on the phone. "You won't last long here," she hissed, and stormed back into her condo, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I knew then this was only the beginning, and Karen was planning something bigger than just angry words on the street. A week later, I found out exactly what Karen had been plotting. She had filed yet another complaint with the HOA board, trying to convince them that my refusal to join their association made me a danger to the community. She even brought up lies, saying my truck was parked illegally and that I hosted disruptive gatherings. The board called for an emergency meeting in the clubhouse, and nearly half the neighborhood showed up, curious to see what drama Karen had stirred this time. Karen strutted in like she owned the place, waving a stack of papers. She tried to sound official, reading her accusations one by one, but each time she spoke, I calmly presented the truth. I showed my property deed, I showed county maps, I showed that I owned not only my cabin, but her very condo unit too. The room fell silent when I said it. Karen froze, her mouth hanging open. Some neighbors gasped, others snickered, and a few shook their heads in disbelief. "You see," I said slowly, "Karen has no authority over me whatsoever. In fact, she pays rent to me." That line broke the room in half with laughter. Karen went pale, her papers slipping from her hands, scattering to the floor. The board quickly dismissed the complaint, saying it had no basis, and warned Karen that further false reports could result in fines against her. Karen stumbled out of the room, humiliated, unable to face the neighbors who were still chuckling behind her. From that day on, she never bothered me again. Whenever we crossed paths, she would look away, avoiding eye contact. The once loud and overbearing Karen of the HOA was now a shadow of herself. And as for me, I finally enjoyed peace at the lake cabin, watching the water shimmer in the evening sun, knowing the battle with Karen was over for good.